I've been chasing whispers on the wind, dreaming of the places I've never been. Time is standing still while time rolls by. Got one foot out the door, ready to fly.
Hey there, everybody. Mark Koep here with the Half of Mine podcast. My guests are Erin and Dan from California. We'll get into their story a little bit, but to set a baseline, since this is our first podcast, I wanted to give you insight on where the name Half of Mine comes from. So back in the day when I was growing up, my drug of choice was mountain biking, and I was a big-time mountain biker. It allowed me to escape from the family divorce and all the drama that goes on with it. I'd come home from school, hop on my bike, go ride for an hour and a half, 2 hours, come home, pass out, rinse and repeat. So that was my drug of choice with mountain biking. And back in the 90s, mountain biking was hot. It's still popular now, but it was really hot back in the 90s. And there was a magazine called Mountain Bike Action, and I subscribed to it, and I got it every day or every month and would read it cover to cover and memorize everything in it. And there was this ad. It popped up. I got really good at mountain biking, really good, like expert level, almost pro, like a really good mountain biker. At one time I was ranked third in the country, second in California, like really good mountain biker. And there was this ad, and it was from Camelback, and I still remember it to this day because it was one of the best advertisements I've ever seen because it spoke to me, right? That's the best ads, the ones that speak to you as the reader of the ad. And the ad was a photo of this really like in shape mountain biker guy flying through the air, and it was like a thought bubble from his mind of what he was thinking, and it said, "Half a mind to quit my job and go full time," right? To become a pro, or half a mind to quit my job and become a pro, right? So that was what I was thinking. Like, I have half a mind just to, let's go for it, let's become a pro. And that thought's always stuck with me. And everybody out there is half of a mind to quit whatever they're doing and actually go for their dreams. And so that's the whole premise behind this podcast. And I thought there were no two better people to kind of kick it off than Erin and Dan. And so I can introduce them, but when I do, I always embarrass Erin. So I will allow Erin and Dan to introduce themselves. Erin, take it away. Who are you and what you got?
I'll let Dan introduce it because you're not wrong. I do appreciate every time that we are in a networking environment that you are my biggest cheerleader. But, Dan does a good job of also. So why don't you introduce us?
So, yeah, we're Erin and Dan Thiem. We're the owners of the Inn-Town Campground in Nevada City, California. We built and opened our campground 9 years ago. And it was kind of a long dream of ours to bring this to fruition, and circumstances allowed it to happen. So, that's kind of how we are where we are now, and it's been quite a journey.
And we'll go into that. So one of the most popular videos that Campground Views has on our YouTube channel is that first interview the three of us did talking about building the campground. Yeah. And as you and I both know, you get people still today who reach out to you and say, "Hey, I'm dreaming about building a campground." And that building a campground, that can actually apply to anything. I'm dreaming about building a business, starting a business or whatever, right? So let's go back to that time before you built the campground. When was the moment that you decided we're actually going to do this?
Oh, I remember it really, really clearly, actually. I was riding my bike through town to go pick up a car. It was at the service station or whatever. And I rode by a piece of property that was for sale. And I stopped and I paused and I was like, this might work. We'd been talking about this campground for years at that point in time. And we kind of had a vision for what it would be, but, I'm a very visual kind of person. So actually seeing a piece of property that was for sale, I was like, all these lights just went off, And so then I go and I picked up the car and I went back and I actually talked to Erin's mom, who's, our local cheerleader here. And I said, "Hey, I think this is going to work." And we drove by and it just started cascading from there. So that was like the first moment where it became, okay, this could be real. This goes from dream phase to visualizing it in an actual space.
Well, let's back up then. So before it becomes real, you started dreaming about it. Can you remember when that conversation started? Like what incentivized you to even think about a campground, and what was that journey like from original spark? And obviously you're sharing with us when you thought it could become real. What's that intervening time? What does that look like?
Yeah.
Before we ran the campground, I managed a motel, which we then subsequently took ownership of. But in the previous version of having had hospitality experience. When Dan went to grad school, we lived in New Zealand and we traveled around. And we have a document from our travels around New Zealand of things that we liked. And I have read it since we've owned a campground and been like, wow, who knew we already had our campground consultant hats on well before this came to life. So that vision of what we knew we liked and what we thought would work started.
I mean, it probably was like 08, 09, somewhere in that time frame. We were living in New Zealand, and we would travel with our children, who were quite small at the time, to various places around the country. But they always had these holiday parks, and I always tell this about kind of like our origin story, that the holiday parks for us were this like transformative experience as a young family traveling. They were easy and convenient to towns. They always had a range of amenities that made it just like traveling with small children.
But still camping.
But yeah, sort of effortless, but you had this like adventure side to it too, right? You know, we were in a camper van or a tent or whatever, and it just resonated. So, you know, when we started, I guess, conceptualizing Inn-Town Campground, it really was at that time. It's like, wow, this is such an amazing thing. And then we kind of talked about moving back, and it was going to be to take over ownership of this motel. And Erin's sales pitch to me, because I didn't want to come back, right? Her sales pitch to me is like, hey, this would give us the flexibility, or me in particular, to go for it, to pursue the dream, right? To build the campground. And, you know, that was like the hook. It was like, okay.
So I went to work and he worked on the dream. So there you go.
Well, and so as a team, let's go a little bit deeper because you're kind of providing insight on that. I obviously we're friends. We know each other offline also. You're a really good couple. Like you get along very, very well, and you both have your strengths and your weaknesses, and you work really well together. Can you discuss how that played into this decision? Because obviously it's a husband and wife team. You work together on the park. You built the park together. How has that dynamic impacted your relationship together, both positively and negatively? And what advice would you give people who are considering that to think about before they dive into doing this?
Yeah, I mean, for me, we have really complementary skill sets. So that has helped kind of alleviate some of the friction points because we don't tend to cross paths a lot in what we do. So it's easier for us to collaborate in that sense. But if you want to back up a minute to the actual like advice, I would say you need to have real honest conversations, both with yourselves and as a couple, as to what your strengths are, what your pinch points are in your relationship, because everything gets amplified when you get into the stressful situation of starting a business or any sort of unknown project. And understanding how you relate to one another and how you cope with stress, what you're good at, what you're not good at, is really important to, at least for us, to kind of, I don't know, minimize the consequences, if you will, the negative consequences. I don't know. What would you say, Erin?
I mean, we've worked on this over the last decade. We have, I feel like we've written about it for Woodalls. We had a point where we had a manager leave, and then we sort of kind of our lanes got mixed up as to who was responsible for what, and we were having some issues with that. And that was really actually helpful for us to go back to like what our respective job descriptions were and what our strengths were. I tell the story as Dan was trying to give me all the tasks that he wanted. So as an introvert, he would rather leave me in a cupboard with no access to people to get all the things I can get done, because I could do that, but I'm a people person. So I'm like, that doesn't actually work for me. So it was helpful to be like, oh, this is the tasks that I can do, but this is the personality type I can do, and let's define that, instead of him being like, well, you should do this and do it the way I like to do things. So
yeah, and we worked with a business coach for a lot of, not a lot, but some of this, right? We recognized that we needed somebody to look at us from the outside and kind of ask maybe some tough questions, or even just help like tease out a little bit of what our preferences were. And Erin was spot on, you know, like I would have approached her job really differently. And I'm thinking, oh, well, this gives you an opportunity to do X, Y, and Z. And she's like, I don't actually want to do X, Y, and Z like that. You know, I want to be in the camp store talking to people. And I was like, wow, that's exhausting for me after an hour. So that's an interesting insight, right? So yeah, we're not afraid to call in professionals to give us some advice. That's for sure.
Yeah.
That's great feedback. So what I've gathered from there, for folks that are watching or listening to this is two key things. Well, several key things, but two key action items that would be in any sort of business development book, which is one, you wrote down your goals and your dreams, kind of physically wrote them down. Here's what we would want to build. And then number two, you went out and seeked third-party help. I've done that in my own business too, because to your point, it's really good advice, because you can get lost in your own dreams, and you can basically miss the forest because you're looking at the trees.
Sure.
And that's a very good piece of advice. Is there anything else? And actually, it kind of leads to the question that I was thinking about before you went there already. Was, can you share insight on the conversations? Was there a moment in time during this dream where you've now found the property and you're kind of thinking about it, where one of you or both of you kind of said, "Let's not do this," or what were those conversations like?
So I remember one conversation in particular, and it was kind of far down the track, right? We had already bought the property, and I guess there's kind of two conversations I remember. The first is, honey, we might have just bought ourselves a really expensive private park. Because, when we bought our property, we didn't know if the zoning was going to work. We didn't know, there were some like easement issues, and there was a lot of unknown that we didn't have the opportunity to condition the offer with. We had to take a punt, and we did. So there was that piece. And then we went through all of the use permit and all that, and I was about to sign the first big contract.
Yeah.
And I called Erin. I said, honey, I'm close to inking this. Are you sure?
It was a large ticket item, and he was like, "This is before I sign my name on this contract. Like, if you want out, now's
the time, right?"
And I don't think that we were not like at all waffling. It was just more like there's a financial cost to this at this point in time. If for any reason you had cold feet, but we didn't have cold feet.
No, I mean, her response is like, "Let's do it." And I signed that check. Well, not the check. I signed the contract. And
I signed the checks later.
I was all like, holy smokes. And then the contract, we used a local company. He, just like a father-son, grandson type thing, right? And he calls his dad, and he's like, this is going to make dad happy. So that actually made me happy, because I was like, okay, this person is like another small time, just a mom and pop shop. And, I even get kind of chills thinking about it, that this was a big deal for them too. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to see it right. So, funny enough, it actually alleviated a lot of my concerns. I was like, I knew right then that I picked the right people, the right contractor.
Well, you find that in life that sometimes your path gets laid out to you if you're going down the right path, right? And there's roadblocks that get thrown up in your way when it's not the right path. And so to that, in your journey here, there's probably been moments where you were pushing for something and a giant roadblock was thrown up in front of you. Do you remember a time that potentially happened? And if so, what was it, and what was your path after that?
I'm thinking of it in two prongs, in the sense of like, we did some sort of brand awareness sort of revisiting last year, and I went back and reread some of our vision casting from before we even opened the campground, and that was really reaffirming to me, to be like, what we decided we were going to build and what we said we were going to build and what we actually delivered on and still serve today is so consistent. And so I feel like that was reaffirmation of the path. But I feel like the question that you've just asked was more relevant, I think, for our other business, the motel, which we sold, and us just being like, it's time to leave.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I was thinking of it from a different perspective, right? The roadblocks in the development. I handled most of the development side of the business. Erin was all about building the brand and the selling the product, right? So she would do a lot of that while I was working on getting the thing built. And she's right. We got it all done, but boy, there were times where an agency or, some other organization was just like, yeah, no, you're not going to do that. And I mean, it was just really demoralizing. We had one situation with the water company, the water district separate from our city, which is a little unusual. So we had to negotiate with them separately, and they came back with a connection fee that was almost $750,000. And I was like, this is insane, So I called my engineer. I called the head of the agency. I said, we need to meet. This is not right. I called the board member. and we met, and it was just sort of this really toxic environment. You know, they really didn't, in my opinion, want this project to happen. And at the end of the day, I had to get like my city manager involved, and we came to an agreement which was pretty close to what we had calculated we would need for our water connection fee. But that was a moment where I was literally in that meeting. I folded up my paperwork and I said, "We're done. This project is not going to happen if you guys don't come to the table." And I started walking out. And as I was walking out, he's like, "Well, hang on, you know."
Who knew these were negotiable?
Yeah, so that was kind of weird. Yeah, I mean, there's more examples, I guess, but in that particular case, it really was like, oh my gosh,
This might not happen.
What are we going to do?
Yeah. I feel like we had a few other those moments during COVID and being closed and just sort of, I mean, I think it's easier to look back in hindsight and be like, it was such a short window of time. We just had to hold on. But in that space of uncertainty and unknown with like, well, there's a window where if you miss this season, like there's a much larger financial implication. And do we have enough of a runway to go 12 months versus 3 months versus 6 months? So,
Yeah.
Well, and to speed the listeners up, they built the park, they opened the park, and they have now been, is it 3 times, Erin, the number one, voted USA Today's #1 campground in the United States, which is an amazing feat. 3 years running on that award. And so you succeeded, you built it. And so that leads to the next question. How has doing this together as a couple, as a married couple with children, impacted your relationship together?
Yeah.
How do you separate out the business from the relationship, or can you? And if you can't, what do you do to make sure that you still are a thriving couple with a happy family and you can go home and not worry about killing one another?
no. I mean, we still go home and worry about it, but
Yeah.
But I think that, I mean, we talk about, I feel like we're having lots of friends with midlife crises, and the way that I talk about it, like, we're good because we don't have the luxury of communicating badly or holding grudges, because we actually need to work through them, and we're very much willing to do the work on the, like, how could I have approached this situation differently, or what can I learn about it? Or as Dan said earlier, we have complementary skill sets. So certain situations are better suited for me, and certain situations are better suited for him. And I may grumble when he makes me call the, disgruntled customer to have the uncomfortable conversation, and
Yeah.
but I make him write the email responses. But anyways, we will lean into those skill sets when we have to, and
Yeah.
support each other.
But I think, Erin's spot on. We don't have, I think in a lot of relationships, you can mask problems by day-to-day routine. You get up, especially when the kids are younger and you're just like going about your thing, going to work, getting home, making dinner, putting the kids to bed. And there's not a lot of time to really focus on the relationship, or the relationship works simply because you have this joint task list, right? For us, if we're not communicating well, or if we're having a problem, it's like a pretty big financial consequence if it doesn't work out, right? So sometimes I just have to say, honey, you can't do that, right? Or she's like, you're being kind of a jerk. And I really appreciate that, because then that translates into our, kind of married life, which, by the way, they don't separate that well, to be honest with you.
But we like solving problems. I think
Yeah.
that's the other part where we've come to recognize that, like, both of us get a lot of personal satisfaction out of being good employers and being good coworkers and doing something for our community. Like, that helps us as a couple and as a family. I think that they're all integral.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that, one of the things that has been a real saver for our relationship is having, and it's Erin's word of the year is grace, having the grace to recognize when the other person needs space or another activity or their own kind of thing, right? Like I'm more of an introvert, so I sometimes just need a couple of days away by myself. And Erin gives me that freedom to do that. And that's really, really important to have that mutual support, to recognize what the other person needs and allow them to do it, even though it might mean a little bit more of a burden for you.
It's funny you meant that. I was actually going to ask that question, because that's something I've noticed about your relationship, is that you do each give each other space to go do things. Like, Dan will take off and you can go camping, or Erin will go skiing, or whatever. And so you consciously are giving each other that ability to go do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's taken me a long time to not feel guilty about it. You know, especially with the business, it's like because I know when I go away that she can't do all of my tasks, right? And a lot of mine are locations, dependent or time sensitive. And so I feel like I'm burdening her, by being away. I've gotten better at it because I know I'm a better person when I do get away.
I will admit to my fault, like last year he was away and I did some pool maintenance and I have been officially fired from that role because I did not succeed.
She called me in a panic. I was like, this isn't good. Okay.
No, anyways.
Here's what we got to do.
Yeah. So I will pick up the slack where I can, and when there's a safety hazard, I will happily remove myself from said task.
And in all this journey, as you conceived of, built, and operated this property, you're raising a family, and so now your boys, they're graduating from high school, they're going off and getting degrees. How has this journey that you've gone on, have you seen it impacting their lives positively or negatively? Is there stuff you're doing on that side to kind of help them learn through this? And the reason I ask that is, personally, I believe that seeing parents work, struggle, and then succeed is a good experience for kids to actually see that happen. My belief is that it builds character. So the question for you is, does it? Have you seen that be a positive or a negative for your children?
I think the jury's still going to be a little bit out because I think the lessons that the kids are taking, are the kind that will manifest maybe in their early career or things like that. And our older son, he's a sophomore in college. He's already showing some of those like observations, like, oh, I need to start thinking maybe about saving and, what about this? And he's a very empathetic soul. So he kind of understands like when we have a bad day, like how that's impacting us. Having said that, and Erin, you can chime in on this too. You do feel as a parent guilty.
Of course.
A lot of the time, right? Because you have this business. I like to say it's like an adolescent that never grows up, right? It's always going to need this attention. And no doubt that attention has been at the expense of the kids many times over the years. And you feel guilty about it. And you hope that, the positives outweigh the negatives. I think both of our kids are fantastic and they're committed and, kind people that want to, do things in the world and make the world a better place. And that's awesome to see, but boy, you just hope that they're not resentful of all the time you spent doing other things.
They're also super independent. I think that's, I mean, you think about the generations where they latchkey kids and like they have to figure it out for themselves. So being small business owners, I mean, we had some flexibility, but there were plenty of situations where it's like, sorry, kids, you're going to have to figure that out on your own. And as young adults, I can see the benefits of their independence as they are like off and launched into the world. So
that's beautiful. I could have a conversation with Dan and Erin all day, but they booked 30 minutes, and I want to be conscientious of their time. So this has been the first episode of Half a Mind. I really want to get your feedback. Leave in the comments below if you like the concept, if you like the content, and we'll dive deeper into this. Obviously, two excellent people to share on this journey, but the goal here is to empower you, the listener, the viewer, to go live your own dreams, to actually take that half a mind, that little thought in the back of your mind and actually make it a reality. Dan and Erin, you've clearly done that with this business, and I'm always impressed with your structure, your relationship, and the way you two communicate so effectively. So I appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. It's always good to stop and reflect on these sorts of things. So I appreciate the opportunity to be like, how are we doing? I don't know.
And we don't regret it for a second. So, for people listening in, thinking about their dream, it's go for it. If you can make it work, go for it.
Yes. Let me add with that, because I feel very, and you guys know, like my journey's similar to your journey, right, with our business and so forth. And I completely agree with you. I took some time off here. We're recording this in early January 2025, so we just came out of the Christmas and New Year's holiday. And I purposefully and actually painfully during the process forced myself not to work for 2 weeks. It was incredibly difficult. I actually failed at it. I woke up at 4 a.m. one morning and started working, and another night I stayed up till midnight work. Like, it's very difficult. But the point being is that I don't regret any of the journey, right? And so whatever you're going to do, the worst case scenario, and actually, Dan, when you're talking about your kids and you feel guilty about that, I always go to the folks that are working a 9 to 5 in an office, or they have to go to work and they're not there with their kids, where your kids are around you. And the same thing here. I'm working from a home office. I have my children around me. So the reality is life is what you make of it. And my hope is that our viewers and listeners will have half a mind to go do it, and then they can come on and share the journey with all of us. So again, thank you, Dan and Erin, and I look forward to, hopefully we can do this on a regular basis and just share the status and see where this conversation goes. I hope it's valuable to you all, and thank you for listening.
All right.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank
Mark.
you.